My father closed the door in my face the same night my daughter cried herself to sleep because her grandparents never showed up to her birthday party. Welcome back to the Family Revenge Tales. My name is Natalie Sullivan, and before I tell you what happened, I need you to understand something. For 8 months, every single Monday morning, I sat in my SUV outside my daughter's elementary school in Franklin, Tennessee, and I sent my parents $700. Rain or shine, good week or bad week, it didn't matter. I opened my banking app, I typed in the amount, and I pressed send before I even walked into my job at the medical billing office. I told myself I was doing it because that's what a good daughter does. I told myself that money could buy peace in a family that had never really known how to be peaceful. I was wrong. And it took the worst night of my life to teach me that some people will take everything you give them and still tell you to your face that you and your child don't matter. Let me back up. I've been a single mother since Harper was 2. Her father left before she could even remember his voice, and I built our life from nothing. Long shifts, a used SUV with a check engine light I kept ignoring, a small rented house with a leaky faucet I never had the money to fix. I wasn't bitter about it. I was proud of what Harper and I had built together, just the two of us. But somewhere along the way, I convinced myself that if I just did enough for my parents, gave enough, sacrificed enough, they would finally treat my daughter the way grandparents are supposed to treat a grandchild. With warmth, with pride, with love that didn't come with conditions. My father, Richard, and my mother, Elaine, never said thank you. Not once. Every phone call was the same. Groceries were expensive. The pharmacy copay went up. The water heater broke. Could I help just this once? Except just this once became every week, and I kept paying because somewhere deep down, I still believed that if I gave enough, I'd earn something in return. Love, maybe. Or at least basic decency. I remember one call in particular, back in the spring. My mother phoned while I was folding laundry, and after the usual small talk, she got to the real reason for the call. "Your father's brakes need new brakes," she said, like it was the most natural thing to say to a daughter who is already stretched thin. I asked how much. $400, she said, and then added, almost as an afterthought, "We know it's a lot to ask." I sent it that same night. I didn't ask why they hadn't saved for it. I didn't ask why, after decades of working steady jobs, they never seemed to have anything set aside. I just told myself that families help each other, and one day it would even out. It never occurred to me to ask why the help only ever flowed in one direction. Meanwhile, my daughter, Harper, 7 years old, bright-eyed and endlessly hopeful, had no idea that the relationship I described to her was mostly imaginary. She talked about her grandparents like they were characters from a storybook. She'd ask me questions about what Grandma Elaine liked to eat or whether Grandpa Richard liked baseball. And I'd answer her as best I could, always leaving out the parts that would break her heart if she understood them. For weeks before her 7th birthday, Harper planned everything herself. She colored 2 handmade cards, one for each of them, with crayon flowers and her name signed in big, proud letters. She helped me bake cookies, standing on a step stool at the counter, flour on her cheeks, laughing every time the mixer got too loud. And in the evenings, she'd practice this little song she wanted to sing for them when they arrived, something she made up herself, humming it under her breath while she'd brushed her teeth. I watched her rehearse that song more times than I can count, and every time I felt this quiet hope building in my chest that maybe, just maybe, this year would be different. The day of the party, I filled our backyard with balloons and streamers. I strung up lights along the fence. Neighborhood kids came running through the yard playing games. There was a table full of homemade desserts, and Harper wore the yellow dress she picked out herself because she said it made her feel like sunshine. At 2 o'clock, my parents texted, running a little late. At 3, nothing. By 4, the other children were starting to leave, thanking me for the cupcakes, their parents waving goodbye from the driveway. Harper stood by the front gate for a long time watching the street, waiting for a car that wasn't coming. That evening, after most of the guests had gone, I was scrolling through my phone trying to distract myself from the knot in my stomach, and that's when I saw it. Photos on Facebook. My parents, laughing, plates of barbecue in their hands, surrounded by neighbors at a cookout less than 3 miles from my house. Posted 2 hours earlier, while my daughter was still waiting by the gate. Harper walked up beside me while I was staring at the screen. She looked up at me with those big brown eyes and asked, so quietly it nearly broke me in half, "Mommy, did they forget me?" I told her, "No, sweetheart, of course not. They just got busy." I hugged her tight so she wouldn't see my face, because I didn't have an answer that wouldn't be a lie. After I tucked Harper into bed that night, I sat in my car in my parents' driveway. I don't remember making the decision to drive there. My hands just did it. I knocked on the door, and when my mother answered, she didn't invite me in. She stood in the doorway with my father behind her, both of them looking at me like I was the one who had done something wrong. "Why weren't you there?" I asked. My voice was shaking, but I kept it steady enough to get the words out. "She waited for you. She made you cards. She practiced a song for you." My father crossed his arms. "We had somewhere else to be, Natalie." "Somewhere else to be? It was her birthday, Dad. She stood at the gate for 2 hours. My mother finally spoke, her voice flat, almost bored. "We didn't think it was that big a deal. Kids have birthdays every year." "She's 7, I said. "She doesn't understand why the people I told her would always love her can't be bothered to show up." That's when my father's face changed, something hardening behind his eyes. "Maybe you shouldn't have told her that then." "What is that supposed to mean?" He stepped forward, and standing there under the porch light, without even blinking, he looked me dead in the eye and said, "That little girl isn't part of this family." For a moment, I genuinely couldn't speak. I just stood there, waiting for him to take it back, waiting for my mother to say something, anything to soften it. She didn't. She looked away, toward the street, like she couldn't bring herself to meet my eyes. Neither of them corrected him. Neither of them apologized. My father simply reached forward and closed the door in my face, the porch light clicking off a second later, leaving me standing alone in the dark. The drive home was completely silent. No radio, no tears even, just this strange, heavy stillness settling over me. Because in that one sentence, everything clicked into place. Every excuse I had made for them over the years, every missed holiday, every cold phone call, every $700 I had sent without ever once being asked how I was doing, how Harper was doing, whether we needed anything at all. It had never been about family. It had only ever been about what I could give them. That night, after I put Harper to bed, I sat alone in my kitchen for hours, and for the first time in years, I stopped asking myself how I could fix my parents. I started asking myself how I was going to protect my daughter from people who had just told her, without even needing to say it to her face, that she didn't matter to them. The next morning, before work, I opened every account connected to my parents. I canceled the weekly $700 transfer. I canceled the pharmacy auto payments I'd set up for my mother's prescriptions. I canceled the grocery delivery subscription. I removed myself from the utility assistance program I had been quietly funding for over a year. I revoked their access to the small emergency savings account I had let them use whenever they ran short. I didn't send them a message explaining why. I didn't need to. I simply stopped. Within days, the bills started piling up at their house. Their landlord, a man named George Whitman, showed up at their door when the rent didn't come through. Confused, he called me, assuming I was still handling things the way I always had. I told him, calmly, that I no longer managed my parents' finances and that he'd need to speak with them directly. There was a pause on the line, and then he said he understood and wished me well. That was it. For the first time in years, their problems were no longer mine to solve, and I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Room to breathe. A week later, my phone rang. It was my younger brother, Mason. "Nat," he said, his voice tight, "did you stop sending Mom and Dad money?" "Yeah," I said. "Why?" There was a long pause. "Because I've been covering their property taxes for the last 2 years, and their car insurance, and basically every holiday and home repair bill they've had. I thought you knew." I sat down slowly at my kitchen table. I didn't know that. I thought I was the only one. Neither of us had known. Our parents had quietly divided us, taking from each of us separately, letting each of us believe we were the only one holding them up, so neither of us would ever compare notes and realize how much we were both giving and how little we were both getting in return. "Remember when Dad called me 2 Christmases ago?" Mason asked. "Said Mom needed a new furnace and you were too stressed with Harper to help that year, so it had to be me?" I felt my stomach drop. "He told me the opposite. He said you were too busy with work and I was the only one who could help." Mason went quiet on the other end of the line. "They've been lying to both of us for years, Nat, playing us against each other so neither of us would ever say no." "They played us," he said finally, his voice quieter now. "Both of us." "Yeah, they did." We talked for almost an hour that night. 2 adult siblings finally putting the pieces together, finally understanding that the guilt we'd both carried for years hadn't been guilt we owed anyone. It had been manufactured, carefully, by 2 people who knew exactly what they were doing. Mason told me he felt like a fool. I told him I felt the same way. But underneath the anger, there was something else too, something that felt almost like relief. We weren't alone in this. We never had been. We just hadn't known it. We agreed, together, to stop. My parents didn't take the silence well. A few weeks later, my father posted a long message on Facebook, claiming his own daughter had abandoned her elderly parents without warning, painting himself and my mother as victims of an ungrateful child. My mother commented underneath, adding her own version, tearful emojis and all. Friends and relatives started asking questions, and instead of staying quiet, instead of just letting it fade, my father made it worse. When a family friend asked directly why they'd missed Harper's birthday, he replied publicly, in black and white for anyone to see, "She's not our granddaughter." Someone took a screenshot. Within a day, it had made its way through half of Franklin. Church members, neighbors, co-workers, extended family, people who had known my parents for decades, all seeing in plain text what my father had said to my face on that porch. I didn't share it. I didn't comment. I didn't need to say a word. I just let it exist. A few weeks later, our extended family gathered for the annual 4th of July cookout by the lake, the way we did every summer. My parents showed up, clearly hoping enough time had passed, hoping the cookout might smooth things over the way it always had before. My cousin Chloe had other plans. Quietly, without a word, she walked around the picnic tables and set a printed copy of my father's Facebook comment in front of each family member. No speeches, no accusations, just the words themselves, laid out in plain sight. The conversation at the tables slowly died. People read it, people looked up, nobody needed it explained. My Uncle Harold, who rarely said much of anything at these gatherings, finally stood up, looked directly at my father, and said, "Richard, I don't know what happened to you, but a man who can look at his own granddaughter and say she doesn't belong in this family has no business sitting at this table today." Nobody argued with him. My parents sat there for a moment, red-faced, silent, and then quietly gathered their things and left. Nobody stopped them. Nobody chased after them. In the weeks that followed, I watched from a distance as the consequences slowly caught up with them, not because I orchestrated any of it, but because actions eventually find their way back to the people who commit them. Their church quietly stopped reaching out. Friends who used to call every week stopped calling at all. The volunteer group my mother had belonged to for years found reasons not to include her anymore. Neighbors who used to run over at the first sign of trouble stopped showing up. I want to be honest with you. I never celebrated any of it. I didn't feel joy watching my parents lose the life they'd built on other people's sacrifices. I just stopped rescuing them from the consequences of their own choices, and I let the world respond the way it was always going to respond eventually. With the money I would have sent them, I did something Harper had been dreaming about for over a year. I took her to the Great Smoky Mountains for a weekend, just the two of us. We hiked easy trails together, her small hand in mine the whole way. We stood in front of waterfalls and let the mist hit our faces. We roasted marshmallows over a campfire, and she fell asleep under a sky full of stars she had ever seen in her life. On our last night there, sitting by the fire, she looked up at me and said, "Mom, this is the best birthday present ever." It wasn't even her birthday anymore. It had been weeks. But in that moment, I understood something I hadn't fully understood before. I no longer missed the family I had lost, because I had finally built the family my daughter actually deserved. Back home in Franklin, I stood in Harper's doorway that night and watched her sleep, peaceful and safe. And I thought about everything that had changed since that porch light conversation. I realized that forgiveness doesn't always require reconciliation. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for your child is walk away from people who refuse to see her as family, even if those people share your blood. I don't measure family by DNA anymore. I measure it by who shows up, who protects, who loves without keeping score. Choosing my daughter over my parents was never about revenge. It was the greatest act of love I have ever made. If this story moved you the way it moved me to live it, I hope you'll consider subscribing to the Family Revenge Tales. We tell these stories because so many of you have lived versions of them yourselves, in silence, without anyone ever telling you that walking away from toxic family is not betrayal, it's survival. And sometimes it's love. And if you take one thing from tonight, let it be this. You are allowed to stop pouring from an empty cup for people who never intended to fill it back up. Protecting your peace and protecting your children is never something you need to apologize for. As for the deeper meaning behind this story, it speaks to something many families quietly struggle with but rarely say out loud. It shows how financial dependence can be used as a tool of manipulation, and how silence between siblings often allows that manipulation to continue unchecked for years. It teaches the importance of open communication within families, especially around money, so that one person's sacrifice is never hidden from another's eyes. It reminds us that children absorb the emotional weight of adult relationships far more than we realize, and that protecting a child's sense of worth sometimes means making difficult decisions about the adults around them. Most importantly, it illustrates that real family is defined by consistent love, respect, and presence, not by biology alone, and that choosing to walk away from people who repeatedly cause harm is not an act of cruelty, but often the most responsible and loving choice a parent can make.